Welcome to A Slice with Dice, a podcast exploring the ideas, pressures, and possibilities shaping how we learn, lead, and grow. I'm Corey Alderdice. For over 20 years, my work has lived at the intersection of gifted education, leadership development, and school culture, supporting students as they find their strengths, educators as they stretch their thinking, and schools as they build pathways that expand opportunity. Ready to dive in? Here's this week's Slice. There's a growing conversation in higher education right now that deserves a closer look. Not because it's wrong, but because I think it's incomplete. A recent article in the Chronicle of Higher Education makes a compelling case that colleges have, in many ways, stopped rewarding curiosity. The argument is straightforward. Students today are navigating college with increasing precision. They're choosing majors earlier, avoiding unnecessary courses, and moving through degree requirements with a level of efficiency that would have been less common a generation ago. And when you step back, it's hard to understand why they wouldn't do this. College is expensive in a way that shapes behavior. That isn't an abstract concern. It's a reality for families making decisions about tuition, loans, and long-term financial stability. When the cost of a single semester can rival what used to be a full year, the idea of wandering academically or taking courses just because they're interesting starts to feel harder to justify. So students adapt, they become strategic, they minimize risk, they try to make the right choices as early as possible. And the Chronicle's argument is that in doing so, something essential is being squeezed out of the experience. Curiosity becomes secondary to completion. Exploration gives way to optimization. College starts to look less like a place to discover and more like a system to navigate. But I want to push on the edges of that argument for a bit because I think there's another part of the story that doesn't get enough attention. If curiosity is being compressed during the college years, we should ask what's happening before students even arrive on campus. Because a growing number of students are not starting college at zero. They're walking in with significant academic momentum built through programs like advanced placement, dual enrollment, and concurrent credit. In many of the schools I've worked with, it's not unusual for students to graduate with a year and sometimes closer to 2 years of college credit already completed. And that changes the equation. But the way we interpret that change matters more perhaps than the change itself, because there are two ways to think about what those credits represent. The first is what most people default to. You're ahead? So finish early, graduate in 3 years instead of 4, save money, enter the workforce sooner, get a return on investment more quickly. Now that's a clean, logical argument for many families. It's also a necessary one. When cost is part of the equation, and it always is, efficiency isn't just appealing, it's responsible. But there's another way to look at those same credits, and it leads to a very different kind of college experience. What if those credits aren't a head start toward the finish line? What if instead they're a release valve? What if they exist to take the pressure off rather than to speed things up? Because when a student arrives on campus with 30 or 60 hours already completed, something subtle but significant happens. The urgency around hitting 120 hours as quickly as possible starts to fade. That sense that every course has to count in a narrowly defined way begins to loosen. And in that space, something else becomes possible. Students can begin to sample from the full range of what a college offers. They can pursue a second major without immediately worrying about overload or extended timelines. They can add a minor in a field that doesn't directly map to a career path, something like philosophy, a language, or the arts, not because it checks a box, but because it expands how they think. They can study abroad for a semester or even a full year without feeling like they're falling behind. They can take part in internships that require stepping away from campus for a term, whether that's in Washington, D.C. or another city. gaining exposure to industries and ideas that don't fit neatly into a course catalog. They can try something, realize it's not quite right, and change direction without feeling like they've made a costly mistake. Now, none of that is optimized in the traditional sense. But all of it's aligned with the kind of curiosity the Chronicle article is concerned about. And yet, here's where that tension comes back into focus. Because for many students, those early credits don't feel like freedom, they feel like expectation. If you've already completed a year of college work in high school, the assumptions, sometimes spoken, sometimes just understood, is that you should take advantage of that efficiency, graduate early, reduce costs, move forward. And again, that's not unreasonable. But it does mean that something intended to create flexibility often gets absorbed into the same system that's pushing students toward efficiency in the first place. So instead of expanding curiosity, early college experiences can end up reinforcing the very dynamics the Chronicle is describing. Which brings us to a more important question. Not whether programs like advanced placement or dual enrollment are good or bad for students, but what we expect them to do. Are they designed to help students move faster through college? Or are they designed to give students more room once they get there? Because those are not the same goal, and they produce very different outcomes. If the goal is speed, then the path is straightforward. Accumulate credits early, apply them efficiently, minimize time to degree. If the goal is something else, if the goal is to create a college experience where students can explore, adapt, and grow, then those same credits can be used in a completely different way. They can create margin, and margin is what curiosity requires. It's hard to explore when every decision feels it carries a financial penalty. It's hard to take an interesting class outside your major when you're worried about staying on track. It's hard to study abroad or pursue an internship when doing so might delay graduation. But when that pressure eases even slightly, students begin to make different choices. They take a class that doesn't have a clear purpose, at least not immediately. They follow a line of thinking into a field they hadn't previously considered. They build connections across disciplines that wouldn't show up on a standard degree audit. They begin to see education not just as a sequence of requirements, but as a set of possibilities. And I think that's the experience the Chronicle article is pointing toward. And it's still available, but only if the structure around students allows for it. And this is where institutions and educators alike have a role to play, because students will respond to the signals they receive. If the message is that efficiency is the highest priority, they will optimize, they will make safe choices, they will move quickly. If the message is that exploration is valuable, but only when it doesn't interfere with progress, then curiosity becomes conditional. But if the message is that the goal of education is not just completion, but development, then something shifts, especially for students who already have a head start. These students are already in a unique position. They have, in many cases, demonstrated the ability to handle college-level work. They've built academic momentum, and they have, whether they realize it or not, created space within their future college experience. The question is whether they're encouraged to use that space. Because if they are, early college becomes something more than an efficiency tool. It becomes a way to restore some of what the Chronicle suggests is being lost. Not by ignoring the realities of cost and structure, but by working within them differently. And I think that's where this conversation ultimately lands. The Chronicle article is right to raise concerns about diminishing the role of curiosity in higher education. But the solution isn't to turn back the clock or pretend that cost pressures don't exist. Those pressures are real and they're not going away. The opportunity is to think more carefully about how we design around them. Early college programs are one of the few levers in the system that can actually change the experience students have once they arrive on campus. but only if we're intentional about how we frame them. If we treat them as a way to move faster, they will do exactly that. If we treat them as a way to create space, they can do something more. They can give students the freedom to explore without penalty, and in a system that increasingly rewards getting it right the first time, that kind of freedom isn't extra. It's essential. Because curiosity doesn't disappear on its own. It gets crowded out. And sometimes, the difference between a crowded experience and an expansive one isn't more time. It's how we use the time students already have. A Slice with Dice is a production of Aldercube. Thanks for making time to reflect with me. If you're finding value in these episodes, I hope you'll subscribe and help spread the word. Until next time, lead boldly, listen closely, and keep pushing forward. I'll see you then.